The captain recognized his brother, though, and he shouted down to him that I might have been tempted to shout. Excuse me. And he shouted down to him what I might have been tempted to shout had I been a materialized ghost up there. He shouted this: "Welcome to the nature cruise of the century." The captain, still holding onto his bottle, although it was empty now, came down to the main deck at the stern, so that he was nearly on a level with his brother, and Siegfried, because he was so deaf, came as close as he could without falling into the narrow moat between them. That moat was bridged by the stern line, by that white umbilical cord. "I'm deaf," said Siegfried. "Are you deaf too?" "No," said the captain. He had been much farther away than Siegfried from the center of the explosion. He had a nosebleed, though, which he chose to find comical. He had bashed his nose when the shockwave knocked him down on the sun deck. The cognac had exacerbated his sense of humor, to the point where everything was screamingly funny. He thought that the exercises Siegfried had done on the wharf were a lampoon on the dancing sickness they both might have inherited from their father. "I liked your imitation of father," he said. The whole conversation was in German, the language of their infancy, the first language they had known. "80," said Siegfried. "This isn't funny?" "Everything is funny," said the captain. "Do you have any medicine? Do you have any food? Do you still have beds?" said Siegfried. The captain replied with a quotation well known to Mandarax. "I owe much. I have nothing. I give the rest to the poor." Francois Rabelais, 1494 to 1553. "You're drunk," said Siegfried. "Why not?" the captain asked. "I'm nothing but a clown." The random damage done to his brain by cognac made him terribly self-centered. He could give no thought to the suffering others must be doing in the dark and blasted city in the distance. "You know what one of my crewmen said to me when I tried to keep him from stealing the compass, Ziggy?" "No," said Siegfried, and he started to dance again. "Out of the way, you clown," said the captain, and he laughed and laughed. "He dared to say that to an admiral, Ziggy. I would have had him hanged for the yardarm. Hick, if somebody hadn't stolen the hick, yardarm, hick. Excuse me, I would have had him hanged from the yardarm, hick, if somebody hadn't stolen the hick, yardarm, hick. At dawn, hick, if somebody hadn't stolen the dawn." People still get the hiccups, incidentally. They still have no control over whether they do it or not. I often hear them hiccuping, involuntarily closing their glottises and inhaling spasmodically. As they lie on the broad white beaches or paddle around the blue lagoons. If anything, people hiccup more now than they did a million years ago. This has less to do with evolution, I think, than with the fact that so many of them gulp down raw fish without chewing them up sufficiently. People, in parentheses. And people still laugh about as much as they ever did, despite their shrunken brains. If a bunch of them are lying around on a beach and one of them farts, everybody else laughs and laughs, just as people would have done a million years ago. "Hick," the captain went on. "Actually, I have been vindicated. Hick, Siegfried," the captain went on. "I have long said that we should expect to be hit by large meteorites from time to time. That has hick come to hick pass. It was the hospital that blew up," said Siegfried. So it had seemed to him. "No hospital ever blew up like that," said the captain. And to Siegfried's dismay, he climbed up on the rail and prepared to jump to the wharf. It wasn't all that much of a jump, really. Only about 2 meters across the moat, but the captain was very drunk. The captain aviated successfully, crashing to his knees on the wharf. This cured his hiccups. "Is there anybody else on the ship?" said Siegfried. "Nobody here but us chickens," said the captain. He had no idea that he and Siegfried were responsible for rescuing anybody but each other. Everybody on the bus was still on the floor. Siegfried, incidentally, had entrusted Mary Hepburn with Mandarax, in case she had to communicate with Hisako Hiraguchi. Mandarax, as I've said, was useless as an interpreter for the Kankobonos. The captain put his arm across the quaking shoulders of Siegfried and said to him, "Don't be scared, little brother. We're from a long line of survivors. What's a little shower of meteorites to a von Kleist?" 80, said Siegfried. Is there some way we can get the ship closer to the dock? He thought the people on the bus might feel a little safer and surely less cramped on shipboard. Fuck the ship, nothing left on her, said the captain. I think they even stole old Leon. Again, Leon was me. 80, said Siegfried. There are 10 people on that bus and one of them is having a heart attack. The captain squinted at the bus. What makes them so invisible, he said. His hiccups were gone again. They're all on the floor, and they're scared to death, said Siegfried. You've got to sober up. I can't look after them. You're going to have to do whatever you can. I'm not in control of my own actions anymore, 80. Of all the times for it to happen, I have father's disease. Time stopped. As far as the captain was concerned, this was a familiar illusion for him. He could count on experiencing it several times a year, whenever he received news he could not joke about. He knew how to get time going again, which was to deny the bad news. It isn't true, he said. It cannot be. You think I dance for the fun of it? Said Siegfried, and he was involuntarily dancing away from his brother. He approached the captain again, just as involuntarily, saying, My life is over. It probably never should have been lived. At least I never reproduced, so that some poor woman might give birth to yet another monstrosity. I feel so helpless, said the captain, and added wretchedly, and so goddamn drunk. Jesus, I certainly expected no more responsibilities. I'm so drunk I can't think. Tell me what to do, Ziggy. He was too drunk to do much of anything, so he stood by, slack-jawed and goggle-eyed, while Mary Hepburn and Hisako and Siegfried, whenever poor Siegfried could stop dancing, hauled the stern of the ship right up to the wharf with the bus, and then parked the bus under the stern, so that it could be used as a ladder up to the lowest deck of the ship, which would have been unreachable otherwise. Quoth Mandarax, what's lost upon the roundabouts we pulls up on the swings. Patrick Reginald Chalmers, 1872 to 1942. People expected the most trouble to come from the unconscious James Waite. Actually, the most trouble would come from the captain, who was too drunk to be trusted as a link in the human chain, who could only sit on the back seat of the bus and rue how drunk he was. His hiccups had returned. Here is how they got James Waite up on the ship. There was enough extra stern line on the wharf for Mary Hepburn to make a harness for him at the free end of the line. This was all her idea, the harness. She was, after all, an experienced mountaineer. They laid him beside the bus with the harness on. Then she and Hisako and Siegfried got on the roof and hauled him up as gently as possible, and then the three of them got him over the rail and onto the main deck. They would later move him up to the sun deck, where he would regain consciousness briefly, long enough for him and Mary Hepburn to become man and wife. Siegfried then came back down to tell the captain that it was his turn to get aboard. The captain, knowing he was going to make a fool of himself while trying to reach the roof, played for time. Jumping while drunk was easy. Climbing anything the least bit complicated was something else again. Why so many of us a million years ago purposely knocked out major chunks of our brains with alcohol from time to time remains an interesting mystery. It may be that we're trying to give evolution a shove in the right direction, in the direction of smaller brains. That's great. I'll drink to that. God, that was good. I'm going to reread that. It was so good. Why so many of us a million years ago purposely knocked out major chunks of our brains with alcohol from time to time remains an interesting mystery. It may be that we were trying to give evolution a shove in the right direction, in the direction of smaller brains. So the captain, playing for time and trying to sound judicious and respectable, although he could scarcely stand up, said to his brother, I'm not so sure that man was well enough to be moved. Siegfried was out of patience with him. He said, "That's too damn bad, isn't it? Because we just moved the poor bastard anyway. Maybe we should have called a helicopter instead and had him flown to the bridal suite at the Waldorf Astoria." And those would be the last words the brothers von Kleist would ever exchange, except for hup and alley-oop and whoops and so on, as the captain tried and failed to get up on the roof of the bus again and again. But he finally did get up, although thoroughly humiliated. He was at least able to go from the roof to the ship without further assistance, and then Siegfried told Mary to get on the ship with the rest of them and to do what she could for Waite, whom they believed to be Willard Fleming. She did as she was told, thinking it was a matter of manly pride for him to climb to the roof without assistance. That left Siegfried all alone on the wharf, looking up at the rest of them, and they expected him to join them, but that was not to be. He sat down in the driver's seat instead, despite his limbs jerking this way and that. He started up the engine. His plan was to head back for the city at top speed and to kill himself by smashing into something. What's up? Before he could put the bus in gear, he was stunned by the shock wave from yet another tremendous explosion. This one wasn't in or near the city. This one was downstream and out in the virtually uninhabited marsh somewhere. The second explosion was like the first one. A rocket had mated with a radar dish. The dish, in this instance, was atop the little Colombian freighter, the San Mateo. The Peruvian pilot who gave the rocket the spark of life, Ricardo Cortez, imagined that he had caused it to fall in love with the radar dish of the Bahia de Darwin, who no longer had radar, and so, as far as that particular sort of rocket was concerned, was without sex appeal. Major Cortez had made what was called 1,000,000 years ago an honest mistake. And let it be said, too, that Peru would never have ordered an attack on the Bahia de Darwin if the nature cruise of the century had gone ahead as planned, with a shipload of celebrities. Peru would not have been that insensitive to world opinion. But the cancellation of the cruise made the ship an entirely different kettle of fish, so to speak. A potential troop carrier manned, any reasonable person might assume, by persons who were effectively begging to be blown up or napalmed or machine gunned or whatever, which is to say, quote, naval personnel, end of quote. So these Colombianos were out there in the marsh in the moonlight, headed for the open ocean and home, eating the first decent meal they had had in a week, and imagining that their radar dish was watching over them like a revolving Virgin Mary. She would never allow any harm to come to them, little did they know. What they were eating, incidentally, was an old dairy cow who wasn't able to give all that much milk anymore. That was what had been under the tarpaulin on the lighter which had provisioned the San Mateo. That dairy cow still very much alive. And she had been hoisted aboard on the side away from the waterfront so that people ashore couldn't see her. There were people ashore desperate enough to kill for her. She was one hell of a lot of protein to be leaving Ecuador. Ah, what a fucking detail. Bum, 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 bum. Let me read that paragraph again. It's so brutal. What they were eating, incidentally, was an old dairy cow who wasn't able to give all that much milk anymore. That was what had been under the tarpaulin on the lighter which had provisioned the San Mateo. That dairy cow still very much alive. So just picture that. There's an old, worn-out cow under a tarp, still very much alive. And she had been hoisted aboard on the side away from the waterfront so that people ashore couldn't see her. There were people ashore desperate enough to kill for her. Jesus. She was one hell of a lot of protein to be leaving Ecuador. Man. This whole concept, and this is Rick speaking, of like, you know, starvation, and people becoming desperate, people fighting over a single exhausted dairy cow. Such a great symbol of like human desperation, you know, and that the cow becomes like it doesn't even have the decency of like a piece of fruit, you know. Here's an animal that is able to make babies and have parents, and yet we humans only look at it as a protein. It was interesting how they hoisted her. They didn't use a sling or a cargo net. They made a rope crown from her, wrapped around and around her horns. They embedded the steel hook at the end of the cable of the crane in the tangled crown, and then the crane operator up above reeled in the cable so that the cow was soon dangling in thin air, in an upright position for the first time in her life, with her hind legs splayed, her udder exposed, and with her front legs thrust out horizontally so that she had the general configuration of a kangaroo. The evolutionary process which had produced this huge mammal had never anticipated that she might be in such a position, with the weight of her entire body depending from her neck. Her neck, as she dangled, was coming to resemble that of a blue-footed booby, or swan, or flightless cormorant. To certain sorts of big brains back in those days, her experience with aviation might have been something to laugh about. She was anything but graceful. And when she was set down on the deck of the San Mateo, she was so severely injured that she could no longer stand. But that was to be expected and perfectly acceptable. Long experience had shown sailors that cattle so treated could go on living for a week or more, would keep their own meat from rotting until it was time for them to be eaten. What had been done to that dairy cow was a shorter version of what used to be done to great land tortoises back in the days of sailing ships. In either case, there was no need for refrigeration. The tip of the tongue, the lips, the tip of the tongue. There was no need for refrigeration.